So hello everyone and welcome to this FIG Online Academies series of webinars and seminars, an online education event that the FIG quite recently have decided to have some education also online besides the existing academy and age group programs. And this is 4th out of 6 in the series. We decided to start off with 6 events in the midst of this COVID situation all over the world, and today we are in the 4th event in this line. I'm Jani Tanskanen from the FIG Education Commission, and I find today's topic to be quite interesting. Many coaches all over the world wonder that how to get the athletes to be at their best when it matters the most. Let it be the club championships, national championships, or even the Olympic final. So today's topic will be peak performance at the right time, every time. Impact of training load and monitoring. As a moderator today, we will have Paul Hall, and I would like to invite Paul to join us.
Hi Yanni, how are you doing? It's good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you too, Paul. I'm doing good here. It's very warm summer day. How about you? How are you doing?
Here. Yeah, we have 30+ degrees. It's a strange situation we're all finding ourselves in, but we seem to be coping at the moment.
Yeah, let's hope that same goes for all over the world, and we start to get things back to normal as soon as possible. So you're a very well-known figure in the international gymnastics scene, but just to introduce Paul, I will give you your few words. He's currently the head national coach of the British gymnastics men's program. He has been working as a personal coach of the world Olympic medalist Louis Smith and world all-around silver medalist Daniel Keatings. Paul has also been an expert in the FIG academies on all levels and all over the world, and he has more than 30 years of experience of international gymnastics, both in men's and women's programs in numerous countries. So welcome, Paul. I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Yanni. And as you mentioned briefly, our topic for today is all about peak performance at the right time, every time. And our guest speaker will consider the impact of training load and monitoring in achieving this objective. Today's webinar will last for around 60 to 90 minutes, and there will be opportunities to ask questions at the end of the presentation. So please use the Q&A or the chat facility on this Zoom application during the lecture, and I'll do my best to pose as many questions to our expert as possible. Please put your audios to mute and your videos off. And without further ado, I'd like to invite our guest speaker for today, Dr. Bill Sands, to join us now. Welcome, Bill.
Good morning. Well, not morning for you. It's afternoon for you. It's good morning for me. Nice to see you, and I'm looking forward to getting going on the presentation.
It's nice to see you, Bill, and I hope it's not too early for you over there.
No, I fall asleep, and I'll have to call in the dog to wake me up.
Great. Well, I'm really looking forward to this subject. It's a subject close to my heart. It's a very elusive thing to try to get gymnasts to peak at the right time. So any advice you can give will be welcome. Before we start, I'd just like to introduce you formally by mentioning that Dr. Sands was an all-around gymnast and an NAIA All-American. He has authored or co-authored 13 books, more than 100 peer-reviewed articles, 50 book chapters, and over 500 national and international presentations. He was the assistant coach for the 1979 Women's World Championship team, and he trained many USA Olympians, national team members, and national champions. His doctorate is in exercise physiology, and he has served as a US Olympic Committee's senior physiologist, the head of biomechanics and engineering, and the director of USOC's first recovery center. So, Bill, I'm looking forward to this. Over to you. You can start your presentation.
Thank you. And thank you for that gracious introduction. Okay, well, I would like to take a couple of moments to thank the FIG and the FIG Academy for inviting me to do this talk. It's a topic near and dear to my heart. And I have to warn you that I used to teach this at a university, and what I'm going to cover in about an hour, maybe a little more, is what I used to teach in a full semester. So there's a lot of material to go through, and so I'll try and hustle through it to make sure that I get through all of it. As you know, the title is Peak Performance at the Right Time, Every Time, the Impact of Training Load and Monitoring. And I've been working on monitoring things or monitoring approaches for well over 30 years. So I hope that I can share with you some of the important aspects that I've learned over that time. The format of what we're going to do is I'm going to cover three principal areas: load characteristics, peaking and tapering, and monitoring training. I've tried to translate the slides into French, German, and Japanese, and I have to warn you that I have enough trouble with English, so I have no way of knowing whether or not those translations are accurate. But I was hoping that those of you who speak or read and write a language other than English would have an easier time making it through the slides. So load characteristics are fairly self-explanatory. Peaking and tapering is probably one of the things that most coaches are interested in order to win. And monitoring training is what provides the link between planning and performance. So as a form of an introduction, I have to say that we're about preparedness. We can control preparedness and we can make accurate assessments and predictions. Performance is often not within our control. Unfortunately, judges, environment, equipment, temperature, jet lag, sleep problems, all those kinds of things plague athletes at all times. So we may not be in complete control of performance, but we are generally in complete control of preparedness. So I would invite you to be concerned with what you can control. In enhancing preparedness, there's a quote that's been attributed to a variety of people. I've just taken it from Bobby Knight, who's a basketball coach. It isn't the will to win that's important. Everyone has the will to win. What's important is the will to prepare to win. And I wholeheartedly agree with that in substance and spirit. There are a number of components of training that have to be addressed, and this may be old news for most of you, but nevertheless, we start with physical conditioning. It forms the basis of everything that comes after, and physical conditioning is probably the most important aspect of preparation of an athlete, followed by technique. Now, gymnastics uses skills as its means of performance, and so technical proficiency is paramount to winning. Technical proficiency, however, is built on physical preparedness. So it doesn't make sense to be technically prepared if you're not strong enough, flexible enough, quick enough, powerful enough, and so forth to achieve the skills. Tactics refers to things like strategies and music selection, competition selection, order of skill teaching, choreography that may be involved in a performance, and a variety of other things that occur that would probably be considered more background factors. Psychological preparation usually refers to mental training, although I have to say in recent years about all I ever see from psychological preparation is crisis intervention. I wish that weren't the case, but sadly, psychological preparation usually takes backseat to almost everything. And finally, artistry. I think the most advanced gymnasts become artists, and their coaches become more resource persons than the typical dictatorial approach that you take with youngsters in the early stages of learning. There are a variety of principles of training that also always have to be kept in the back of your mind, so that you have criteria or sort of a gauntlet of factors that you judge against what you're imposing on the athlete. The first principle is the principle of increasing demands, which says that you have to continually increase the demands of training, which usually amounts to training load. There's a principle of continuous load demand, which means that you should not be taking long breaks, because deterioration of fitness and skills can happen, and although skills are more stubborn, you can keep skills for quite a long time. The example always is you always remember how to ride a bike, but the fitness characteristics that underlie those skills are extremely important, and you must continue to train without long breaks, unfortunately, like we've had with the COVID crisis, that we may be able to address later. Cyclic arrangement of load demands refers to the idea that you have punctuated loading, where their load demands are punctuated by rest periods, and there's each load demand is also followed by a relative rest period, and you arrange those in cycles in order to enhance fitness most efficiently. The principle of awareness is the idea that the athlete is aware of what you're doing and why you're doing it. Too often, coaches seem to keep things secret, and the athlete is unaware of why they're doing what they're doing. And unfortunately, that cuts off one of the best sources of feedback that you could have about how your training is going. The principle of planning and the use of systems, I saw that from the schedule that there's going to be another presentation on planning. But planning and use of systems is where periodization comes in. Periodization for gymnastics is somewhat of a tricky topic, unlike endurance sports and strength sports where skill components are not quite so prominent. The principle of visual presentation just means that you use visual things, video, things that weren't available back in the Cretaceous period when I was a gymnast. One of my students asked if I had any video of my performance as a gymnast years ago, and I had to tell them that camcorders and video recorders had not been invented then, and so I had to resort to Super 8 film, and most of those are gone. The principle of feasibility is just that it's a reasonable approach, that you're not going to overwhelm the athlete or the system in whatever you're asking them to do. The principle of individualization is paramount to when we get to monitoring, and that refers to the idea that it's really an individual you're training, not a group. Okay, so I would encourage people to develop an idea or a model of how they view performance and preparation. The first step in that is to determine crucial factors. The second step is to study the sport or event history. Make sure you know how the sport has progressed over time, or a particular event, for example. You should analyze the historical and data trends to predict future performance, which is difficult in a skill sport like gymnastics. You can rely on mathematical methods, your gut, rules changes, and just attending and cataloging various aspects of competitions. You need to examine current performance for possible future trends, and hopefully you're not surprised by sudden rules changes which have happened. You want to calculate and determine the future contending performance, add your current trends, and determine peak periods. Determine the athlete team and current status by virtue of fitness, all those training factors, and know where the athlete is when you begin. Then you determine the difference between the current status and what a predicted contending performance will be. And then you determine that difference so that you can see whether or not contention is unlikely, the difference is too great, your athlete is not good enough, not strong enough, not flexible enough, not experienced enough in order to achieve the predicted necessary performance aspects. If the athlete's contention is unlikely, then you should revise your goals and expectations, fix your problems, and start over. If contention is likely and current status is greater than or equal to your prediction, then you just employ monitoring to exploit performance variables to help the athlete win. Sports performance measures such as time, distance, speed, height, etc., are really easy to predict. Track and field, swimming, any sport that uses a stopwatch, tape measure, or something of that nature is relatively easy to predict. Gymnastics is very difficult to predict. There have been a few efforts looking at changes of skills based on the code of points and historical development, and they have been extremely interesting. I'm not sure that's something that's within the reach of most coaches. So you can gain insight into what about gymnastics and its future by checking environment and competition conduct, age of athletes, apparatus specifications, number of judges, and so forth. Since we have a judged sport, how judges see things is obviously important in determining a score. Fortunately or unfortunately, we've had, not so recently, but we've had apparatus kind of foisted on us. Changing from the horse to the vault table was one example. The constant upgrades of spring floors to become more springy. Fiberglass rails, round rails, sprung ring cables, and so forth have been changes that have been, generally speaking, well accepted, but they usually come as a surprise. Rules changes have been foisted upon us as well. Difficulty and combination requirements are interesting. Interestingly enough, gymnastics is probably one of the only sports where you change virtually all of the rules almost every 4 years. It would be like in basketball changing the height of the rim whenever there's a new competition that comes along. So in order to predict the future, you really have to know what's happening with the rules. You can compare yourself with other teams and athletes, and you can look at different kinds of performance preparation and performance enhancers, such as weight training, foam pits, and other aspects of training and performance. Gymnastics tends to progress suddenly, where you see people performing certain things in certain fashions, and then suddenly something comes along, and all of a sudden the nature of gymnastics changes dramatically. You can see from a historical standpoint on the left that there are a variety of things that have changed over the years, and the advent of different skills, the popularity of different skills, and normalization of those skills continues to this day. Oftentimes you look at how people are performing, you go, oh my God, it can't get any better. And it does, it always does. So you have to use your best judgment, which should include data, to determine what is your optimal preparedness. You should try to determine what will your athlete need to win in the future. And the future could be a month, a year, a career, from one Olympiad or one Olympic cycle to another. You can do that by using the athlete's current status, judging and assessing their strengths and deficiencies, and then make recommendations or see recommendations by using something I call a PERT chart, which stands for Performance Evaluation Rating Technique, which is an idea I stole from business. And I'll show you what a PERT chart looks like here in a second. The physical components that go into preparing your athlete consist obviously of fitness characteristics that are shown on the left. And then there are technical components that are largely broken down skill by skill and event by event, so they're difficult to classify. I think this model from Sif and Verkhoshansky is a particularly useful one because it demonstrates physical components with a lot of hyphens. Speed, strength, strength, speed, strength, skill, and so forth indicates that there's sort of a blending of different physical preparedness characteristics that is important for coaches to understand. It's not as simple as strength, speed, and flexibility. All of these various factors interact with each other and in order to produce performance. The technical components, as I said, probably it breaks down more or less to skills and techniques. Tactical components include periodization, the selection of skills, the order of skill learning, selection of teaching methods, selection of music, selection of competitions, do you go or not go, training camps, how important is a competition, how important is it for you to be there, is it important politically or is it important from an experience standpoint, and then of course rest and recovery. Psychological components include things like mental training. I use a paradigm that includes relaxation, concentration, imagery, ritualization, resiliency, and fatigue management. And I will periodize it based on those factors. Relaxation takes place first, followed by concentration, followed by imagery, followed by ritualization, and finally dealing with the stress of performance and training, a resiliency factor, and then how to manage the athlete's fatigue. Here's an example of a PERT chart. And I promise I used these back in the Cretaceous period when I was coaching. You make a chart with the athletes' names along the left. here, athlete A, B, C, D, etc. And you put the components of what you want to prepare along the top row. So in this case, I just simplified it for women, vault, bars, beam, floor, and tumbling. And there's a score given by the coaches or from data that is, in this case, some score between 0 and 10. And so I rate athlete A, B on vault, bars, beam, floor, and tumbling. I sum the values for vaulting to get a column sum. I sum the rows to get a row sum. The column sums tell me where my athletes as a group are strong and weak. So clearly the area that's most efficient in this particular made up PERT chart is vaulting. So when I plan and develop my performance plan for the future, I am going to take a serious look at vaulting to make sure that I can take it out of being the most efficient area. If I sum along the rows, I learn which athlete is my best prepared athlete at that time. I used to require all of my coaches to do this kind of an approach for every athlete at the beginning of each mesocycle. By doing so, I could check to make sure that everyone has a consensus opinion about how an athlete is current status and what kinds of deficiencies the athlete has. By coalescing or combining those things, I could make a much more intelligent prognosis and diagnosis of the athlete's condition and then plan more efficiently and effectively. This is a more extensive plan that's based on data. So in this case, these are actually real values, but using fitness scores in this case with an age, VO2, standing long jump. I wouldn't do VO2 with a gymnast probably, but different kinds of strength and power performances. And then I use the mean and standard deviation here and here to set up percentile ranks for each level of scores. So if I take an example athlete who is 14 years old, has a VO2 of 44, standing long jump of 2 meters 19, and so forth, these yellow blocks indicate the performance of the athlete in each type of fitness. And as you can see, you develop a profile of what the athlete looks like from a fitness standpoint, and you can do the same thing with events. You can make the list of aspects that you're interested in extremely long. So you can include psychological variables, tactical variables, other fitness characteristics, event performances, you name it. And so by doing so, I can use real data to make a much more educated and effective assessment of where the athlete sits. So you can see that this athlete is good in strength and power, and then relatively poor in flexibility and stamina. So that information can be extraordinarily important in the planning for the future for that particular athlete. So we use PERT charts for quality control. PERT charts were developed as a part of total quality management. If you've been involved in any business things, which I have not, I just steal things that I think are important. Total quality management is a method of maintaining and attaining a standard of quality in the control of a process, which is training. PERT charting helps maintain objectivity in the use of information on the athlete and the status of the athlete. It helps alert coaches to the status on all events, everything that you're concerned about. Individual values can be changed to suit specific athletes and circumstances, depending on whether you're comfortable with the outcome of the analysis, and you have automatic records and history of training and progress. And if I was to ask coaches if they keep records of training and progress, at least in the States, I would generally find that they do not. So now you need to link your resources to your goals, keeping in mind what your PERT chart told you was effective or doing well and what was deficient. In this case, we're going to look at allocating time and resources. What are your goals? How much total time do you have? What percentage would you assign to each goal? And the point is to make a 100% complete athlete by assigning various percentages to the resources you have that you will devote to your athlete. Then you allocate time and resources based on your goals and objectives. That allocation comes together in a plan that looks like this. Now, I picked women's events just simply because I was a former women's coach, but I've done it for men as well. And so it really doesn't matter whether it's men or women. So I've simplified things. Again, you can make it much longer and much more detailed. You can have subsets or subtypes and make it much more complex. For warm-up, I want to have 10% of my time resource spent on warm-up, 5% on vault, and you can read the rest. In order to ensure that my goals are achieved, I have to ensure that my resources are spent in this fashion. Now, if I decide all of a sudden that I'm going to change things and I'm going to establish now it's 30% for vaulting, then all of these have to be adjusted because I have limited time in order to accomplish my goals. So let's take an example. Let's say you train from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m., Monday through Friday. The total time per microcycle is about 15 hours or 900 minutes. The total time per mesocycle is 4 weeks, or I'm just establishing it as 4 weeks, or 60 hours, 3,600 minutes. You will break down your mesocycle and your microcycle based on the amount of time that you have available. Time is often the enemy. How do you know you're going to have enough time to teach an athlete the new skill that is necessary for them to win? If you have enough time, by all means, go ahead. If you don't have enough time, you probably want to reevaluate that goal. And if you've been coaching for any length of time, you probably know roughly how long it takes for an athlete to achieve a particular skill change. Okay, so if I take the percentages that I established for my goals for each of these activities, then if I apply those, I find that in my mesocycle, I have about 6 hours of time spent on warm-up, 3 hours on vault, 12 hours, etc. And it gives me a good idea of whether or not I'm going to have enough time to get everything done that I have to get done, and without getting to the end and finding out that I didn't allocate enough time to finish the learning of a particular skill or the acquisition of a particular routine or development of a particular fitness characteristic. And so I'm sure coaches have been caught finding out that by the time they finish, or by the time they've completed a mesocycle, there isn't enough time left to finish the learning to make the skill ready for competition. And I tried to do this in order to prevent that from happening. Of course, it happened to me. That's why I came up with the plan. A microcycle is done in much the same way. You would take warm up. Here are the activity goal allotments. You figure out how much time you have available, and then you assign the number of hours and minutes based on your percentage allocations. Now, these are not carved in stone. If you find that some of them just don't make sense when you're starting to apply it, well, then you go back and fix it. But you know what you wanted to accomplish, and you have your goals set up in a sort of linear fashion in order to achieve it. Okay, so the microcycle is the smallest unit of planning, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But if you have a training program going on and you have an athlete that misses one day, let's say, because of a family commitment or school or whatever, are you really worried about the athlete's loss of fitness or loss of skills or something missing one day? The answer is no. If you miss 2 days, I might start to get a little concerned. If I miss 3 days, I'm getting concerned. If I miss 4 days, I'm very concerned. And so the microcycle is the smallest unit of planning because you can do a lot of modification and on the fly planning and changing. during the microcycle with the intent of always having this allocation of your resources in terms of time completed by the end of the microcycle. Okay, so then you take percentages from your model, apply the percentages to the time you have available, and then sort of like a chess game or checkers or whatever, you apply those percentages to the time you have available. And so my schedule is shown on the right, and I've shown the allocated minutes that are based on my goal percentages and the amount of time that I have available for each. And because you've got a circumstance that I left here on purpose, because I only have 15 minutes allocated 3 times, so I have 45 minutes total for floor exercise, I may want to put 2 of those together on one day to make 30 minutes. Dance, that's basically what I did for dance. So 27 minutes, you may disagree, which is fine, with the allocation of time and resources, but this method has been shown to be effective, for me at least, in ensuring that I know what I'm doing and that I have a record and I can show what happened and what kinds of outcomes I achieved. You can also spill over some time from one area to another because, you know, the athlete has almost learned it and just a few more repetitions, a little more time, and they'll get it. This is, again, not carved in stone. It serves but as a pretty simultaneously rigid and flexible guideline. Okay, can you still be flexible in your application of training loads and time? Of course you can. At the end of the microcycle, you should just be pretty close to the goal time and other resource values. If something upsets your schedule, worldwide infection, you may have to revisit how you're going to set up your goals in order to make up for the time that was missed or the resources that were missed. What about conditioning? You have to check your status and your model and assign conditioning tasks based on your desired preparedness and your current status. It's not quite as simple as just doing it mathematically. So, but that's okay. As long as you know what you wanted, what you ended up with, you can determine whether or not you missed something or had deficiencies. Before I did this, I vividly remember going from one mesocycle plan to another and finding out that I hadn't done any balance beam dismounts in the previous mesocycle. And I thought, oh my goodness, I need a method that will keep me from making that kind of mistake. Okay, so now let's move from overall planning to managing the training load and moving it to your calendar. So this is where planning and periodization comes in. The classic model of periodization is shown here by Matveyev, where volume starts high and declines, intensity starts low and then increases. It's a pretty old model. The text is from 1977. You're controlling volume and intensity in terms of how much you have them do. That's usually a skill count or routine count. And intensity, the difficulty of how they do of the skills and how many skills they do per unit time. The Matveyev model is perfectly adequate for athletes of middle and lower level qualifications. It tends to break down for elite athletes. And the reason is primarily this area here in the middle where both volume and intensity are high at the same time. And thus you're kind of exposing yourself to more likely periods of injury. Zatsiorsky's model, I think, is more effective and efficient for gymnastics where, let's face it, you can't do half of a somersault. That's dangerous and dumb. So intensity tends to stay high forever. And you moderate or allocate the punctuations of work and rest by monitoring volume. And so the number of skills, the amount of time spent training and so forth are used to moderate how you ensure that the athlete gets rested at appropriate times. But you're going to insist on pretty darn good performances pretty much forever. Okay, other approaches have been proposed. There's approaches that have little planning or direction where you just sort of get together and work out. One by Verkhoshansky, which he's a track and field guy, so His approach is a little simpler in terms of what kind of performance outcomes you want, but his preparedness is built upon areas of preparation that build from each other. General conditioning to max strength, to a focus of max strength, to gymnastics, to skill development, combination development, routine development, and so forth. So these periods have been called blocks. I guess the terminology may not matter, but that's the sequence where you're potentiating the effects of the previous conditioning or training approach to the following conditioning or training approach. This conjugate sequence system has been around for some time. I think Verkhoshansky is a genius, and I would suggest that this is a very nice way to train, particularly for athletes of middle to upper middle qualifications. For elite athletes, ICERN came up with this idea of block periodization, and it seems like block periodization shows up as a garbage can term, where he describes things as an accumulation, a transmutation, and a realization or competition. Now, accumulation just means enhanced fitness. Transmutation comes from the idea, it's like an old chemistry thing where you transmute mercury to gold. And transmutation was changed by Bompa, for example, to be convert. He called it the conversion phase. I'm not sure I like either term, but nevertheless, this is when you take your enhanced fitness, skill learning and whatnot, and then you magically change it to something that's useful for gymnastics. Then there's a realization or competition phase, and then finally a transition or rest phase. This has been proposed by ICERN primarily because he found that athletes are competing 12 months a year. And the old approach of having a long preparation period and competition period no longer fits for the best athletes. So I offer those as opportunities to use them depending on the nature of your athletes and what you think is appropriate. This is an example of a men's gymnastics yearly plan, and I'm going to break it down in a second, but as you can see, the competitions are along here. You should have seen documents like this before. Locations of competitions. This was for the USOC men's gymnastics team. There's a training phase, strength phase, power phase, endurance phase, skill acquisition, combinations, routines, psychological preparation, nutritional preparation, the different macrocycles, the different microcycles, a peaking index for each competition, testing dates, medical control when they get the orthopedist to give them a hairy eyeball exam, training camps, planned rest periods. Note that there are several planned rest periods where training load will be reduced. Vacations may or may not apply. School breaks and whatnot may apply. Because I was running the recovery center, I built in recovery methods also to include recovery center massage, on-site massage, different kinds of contrasts, and so forth. Then I like graphics to show how physical, technical, tactical, and psychological preparation are emphasized throughout the period. Okay, this plan was presented to the men's program. I'm not sure they followed it, to be honest, because they tend to be pretty independent thinkers. But nonetheless, this is what I tried to help them with. So here are the training objectives for that period. They wanted to reduce deductions, hit a 90% hit rate, which I'm fairly certain they've never achieved. Tests and standards, what tests are you going to use? What kinds of physical preparation is involved? What kind of technical preparation is involved? Tactical, psychological, and so forth. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. Okay, so now we're going to break down the season. So we're going to have a general preparation, specific preparation, pre-competitive, competitive, and transition. And I would do this even if I was using ICERN's method. So in the beginning, you work on skills, then combinations, then routines and competition simulations. Then you go to competition and then you rest. I don't think that's any big surprise. This has been an approach amplified and presented for decades. Okay, so the competitive phase and the various aspects of your long-term plan, be sure to plan brief recovery phases. So it doesn't mean that they don't train. It simply means that you reduce the training load, which usually means a decreased skill count, not a reduction in intensity. And, or you can reduce training time, which is automatically going to reduce skill count. These I've already gone through, so I think you will probably recognize that. Okay, then the recovery things involve determining whether or not the competition is important. Terminology that I have used in the past is I would train through a competition where I didn't really reduce or taper before a competition and just train straight through, or if the competition was important enough, then I did indeed use a taper. So tapering is beyond what I'd like to talk about with this presentation. So again, make sure you have planned recovery periods. In terms of recovery, we do know that people tend to adapt to different recovery methods. So you have to vary the recovery methods or they become less and less effective. Okay, again, I like to do things visually, physical, technical, and so forth, preparation to show where the emphasis is and be able to refer to it in a quick way so that I can communicate to the athlete what's going on. Okay, so let's take an example of this approach using strength. This is comes from Verkhoshansky again. There are different durations that are involved in loading. And so in this case, we're looking at volleyball players, but in this case, we're looking at periods of months along the x-axis. And in this case, we're looking at weeks. But note that the shape of the adaptations are roughly the same. And so if you're a mathematical junkie, this is fractal, okay? If we look at this particular athlete, here, number 4, the athlete shows that they decayed quite a bit during the concentrated loading period and then never really fully recovered. And then if you are familiar with the literature for this, this athlete was injured. So by monitoring the adaptation, you could have perhaps prevented this athlete's injury, or at least you know that this athlete was fatiguing far more than the other athletes involved. Okay, the concentrated loading periods are shown here. So that's a period when you're really going to put the hammer down and they're going to train especially hard. Okay, then following that, there are periods of relative rest. Should be obvious and certainly present in most of the literature on periodization. Is one pattern better than another? It turns out that there is a better pattern. If you use a period of concentrated loading, you tend to get an adaptation that looks something like this, assuming you allow them to rest. If you don't do that, if you kind of just get together and work out, let them self-administer their training loads and so forth, it tends to look more like this. And although this is speed strength for volleyball, I think you can tell the difference in adaptation that was achieved by both methods. Recovery is what happens after the period of concentrated loading. And again, it doesn't mean they don't train. It just means that the training load is reduced, generally speaking, for gymnasts in volume. Okay, so this is another way of looking at how this happens. If we look at their homeodynamic or allostatic state, this is their initial condition, then we impose a period of concentrated loading. You can get an adaptation that looks something like this, where their fitness decays, they recover, they supercompensate, and then they decay, recover, supercompensate again. But the challenges are too little. The periods of concentrated loading are too small. And so, are too small in magnitude, not in duration. And so you just kind of undulate right around their typical fitness level. And I would have to say that I've seen this pattern a number of times when I was at the USOC, primarily from team sports, because they have a difficult time doing concentrated loading. Then you have another pattern that's the most desirable one, where there's a decay in fitness, then a recovery and a supercompensation. Then it reaches a peak where the next challenge occurs. So after the recovery adaptation, you put the hammer down again after, after they have fully recovered, and they decay, recover, supercompensate, again, it goes on and on and on. So that you can systematically control their fitness and in turn control their skills and preparation. If you're really stupid, or what I learned was wrestling at the USOC, you will beat the snot out of them for a long period of time. They will start to recover, but then before they get a chance to recover and supercompensate, you hammer them again and again and again. So unfortunately, the only way that wrestlers seem to ever rest is to get injured. And so that's one thing you might look at your training program, is that are athletes using injury as a means of rest? This fits together because of the interaction between fitness and fatigue. Fatigue is acquired and decays fairly rapidly. Fitness decays and is acquired fairly slowly. The difference in the rates of acquisition and decay, or decay and acquisition, is what allows you to link together fitness and fatigue cycles in order to achieve peak performance. So as fatigue and recovery work on the athlete, they are fatigued here where fatigue is high, they recover and supercompensate, then they have another period of high training, and then a high training load, and then the same cycle is repeated over and over. You should expect peak performance to occur when the distance between fitness and fatigue is the greatest. Now, this is assuming the standard classical model of periodization, which I'm going to admonish here in a second. Okay, so the classic model of periodization is shown here by a diagram made by Mike Stone. And it shows the typical approach that's been examined and emphasized for decades, where your training load starts out low, goes higher, higher, and then rest. Load, higher, higher, rest, higher, higher, rest. Your preparation looks like this black line. Fatigue follows roughly the red line. Okay, this is pretty standard and frankly is perfectly appropriate for athletes of middle and level and lower qualifications, and for periods that are not involving competition or preparation of serious skills. Then this is a different approach that Dr. Stone emphasizes for focusing on power and speed. And what he talks about is the idea that if you use the old method, by the time you get to this period in your mesocycle, your athletes are feeling like dog breath. They're tired and they can't do much. And in a skill sport like gymnastics, they need to be fresh at some times in order to be able to do their skills. So you do raise the training load extremely high in the beginning, and then you give them moderate training loads for an opportunity for them to rest and continue to be effective in skill learning and skill performance. And you do that in a sequential fashion as shown here. I think this is a rather genius approach to training, especially for skill sports like gymnastics. Okay, you combine these approaches by having the traditional approach done during the strength phase of your athlete, where you're going to be loading them high and you don't care if they get tired. Then you have a period of recovery separating the high strength phase, and you're converting or transmuting them to the period where they are going to be preparing skills and doing competitions. So I think this approach is more appropriate for skill-dominated sports than the traditional approach, which is shown here. Okay. Do these patterns actually occur? Because I remember looking at these things in books, Tudor Bompa's book, and Verkhoshansky, and Matveyev, and Yakovlev, and others trying to learn more about periodization. And I thought, wow, it would be really nice if I could change or focus my understanding on just simply looking at these lines. So I decided to study it. So I'm going to show you some data. This was using an isometric knee extension breaking strength test. This device, where is it? Oh, it's over here. This Nicholas is a Nicholas manual muscle tester. And so what I did is I put the athlete's knees in 30 degrees of flexion, and I told them, I'm going to press on your shin or your shank, and I don't want you to allow me to move you. So as I pressed down, they resisted. When they couldn't resist me anymore, I pulled it off. It's got a load cell in it, and then just wrote down the force that was applied. Okay, so I also took the sum of 4 skin folds over an entire academic year. Here are the skin folds. Here's how I tested strength. And so here's what I got. So here's the period when they first arrived for training after summer break. You can see that their fitness is improving in newtons per kilogram to this point, and then that suddenly their fitness goes in the toilet when they start doing routine development. Routine development is by far the most demanding period for physical preparation for gymnasts. But you can see they show a Selye general adaptation syndrome curve where there's a decay, a recovery, somewhat of a supercompensation. Then they go on Christmas break, they come back, and they show their fitness and their isometric braking strength throughout this, where just before NCAA Nationals, they're almost at their highest level. Okay, so now we know that gymnasts, male and female, have to be on the lean side of lean, which means their body composition is also important. And so during these tests, I also recorded the sum of the 4 skin folds. If you look at this period here, this is a perfect example of a Selye general adaptation syndrome. Decay, recovery, supercompensation, okay? It doesn't look all that fascinating at the moment, but, and then you have to ask, you know, how come it looks like their peak strength level occurs after nationals? Why is that? So what if I express newtons per millimeter or force in knee extension braking strength per millimeter of skin folds? Then we see the kind of decelerating rise in fitness. The decay, recovery, and supercompensation is still present, that Selye general adaptation syndrome curve. Then we see their change in fitness continue to increase over all the competitions, and because they compete roughly once a week, until the week before nationals, where they achieve the highest level of fitness of the whole year. So did they peak at nationals? They absolutely did. And there's the data to show that their preparation should have predicted that, and it did. Okay, so their peak strength here was achieved just before nationals. They hit all routines, did a wonderful performance. And then this part shows that after nationals, their fitness level decayed, mostly because they stopped restricting their caloric intake. And so their skin fold sums went up, but their fitness stayed about the same. Okay, the last 2 microcycles before a competition, I think it's important to understand the nature of tapering for gymnastics. Training loads should be, assuming the competition is on a Saturday, where the peak would be on the Monday 2 weeks before, lowered through Wednesday, gradually increased through Saturday, where there might be a simulation competition. Then the week just before the competition, the Sunday is a low training load, Monday is medium, Tuesday is high, Wednesday is a rest day or very low training load day. And then it's very important that their training load be increasing as they approach the competition on that Saturday. I believe, and I think there's data to support it, that giving them full days off prior to a competition is foolish. They should be increasing their intensity in training immediately prior to the competition, but it's not maximal. Okay, that takes us to monitoring. So training is a process, and training is complicated, and training programs suffer wear. If you find a training program that works spectacularly 1 year. It will not give you the same results if you impose it on the next year. The training programs don't necessarily last like a artifact. Okay, I want to emphasize evidence-based coaching. Coaches are in the best position to know, but information is often hidden, subtle, fragile, and subject to variability. And so, although coaches should know, and they are in the best position to know, they often don't. You have to consider load and monitoring simultaneously. You can't do them separately. Dosage is like a drug. You give them a dosage, which is training load. It's what you do to the athlete. Response is what happens to the athlete. Okay. The best is enemy of the good. That just implies that if you've got something that really works, then you have to make sure that it doesn't become the enemy of the mediocre or more mediocre approaches. One of the problems with monitoring is a consensus trance. This is something that comes from business, where you have people who seem to look around and they notice how things have been done, roughly how everyone else is doing it, and they come to sort of a consensus that stops them from thinking. And so they don't continue to pursue better performances because they have a general consensus among themselves and their peers that everything's going fine. And then the typical coach who's really arrogant, they already know. The main obstacle to progress is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. I think that's one of the most important quotations I've ever seen. Okay, so let's test your ability as coaches to observe. So what I'd like you to do is to count the number of F's in this block. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. So you're counting the number of F's. Okay, got them? All right, how many did you count? 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Normally in a lecture thing, I would ask for a show of hands, but you can raise your hand if you'd like, but I can't see it. Okay, so the correct answer is 6. How many did you get? Okay, the thing that's nice about data is that with the data in front of us, we can finally talk intelligently about what's actually there. We try to observe accurately, but we human beings basically suck at it. If you talk to people in law, eyewitnesses are among the worst aspects of trial law, because eyewitnesses only see some things. Okay, here's another one. Count the number of passes done by players dressed in white. So again, count the passes done by the players wearing white t-shirts. So how many passes did you count? I must admit that I fell for it. If I play it again and you didn't see an event happen, watch it closely now, but don't count the passes. Did you notice something walk through the middle of the people passing the basketballs? I must admit, the first time I did this, I did not see that. That's because of a perceptual characteristic that humans have where you tend to see what you're looking for, not necessarily what is there. Okay, so coaches are in the best position to see what's going on in training, but don't be deceived by the idea that you're infallible. Okay, leading us now to monitoring. Gymnastics athletes tend to work closely and individually with a coach. It's not a team sport like soccer or football or basketball or whatever. Coaches and physicians have the same covenant. Physicians must heal one patient at a time. Physicians don't treat some average patient plus or minus a standard deviation. Coaches must prepare one athlete at a time. There is no collective performance, only the sum of individual performances. So let's take a look at an example. I have 20 elite athletes. I'm doing a study on vertical jump. I do a pre-test. I impose a training program. I don't have a control group because I almost never would. Then I do a post-test analysis. The treatment is designed to improve strength and power. I get a statistically significant improvement in my vertical jumps. Here's the data analyses, okay? Unfortunately, athletes 2, 5, and 8 actually got worse. And they are my only podium prospects. The rest of the athletes, although they improved, don't have a snowball's chance in hell of being on the podium. So would you consider this a successful training outcome? I've given this example all over the world, and I haven't found a coach yet that thinks that this would have been successful. So in spite of the fact that the physiologist who did the test can tout the statistical significance and go on the lecture tour and go to Hollywood and make tons of money and, you know, become addicted and then do rehab and addiction and rehab and whatnot, it doesn't fit our needs in sport. So if you understand that you're going to have to monitor individuals as opposed to teams, what is worth monitoring? What data are useful? The search for markers has been going on for decades, and we haven't really found anything. And in my opinion, the reason is because we won't. We will never find a single marker. The dose-response relationship is what we're really interested in. Practical monitoring, we find that the data are often in the noise. And we want to do idiographic, which means single subjects, not nomothetic, which means groups. And we want to detect anomalies. We don't really care if the group has gotten better or worse. We want to detect anomalies in individuals, and we detect those by departures from stability. Okay, so dosage units of measurement include volume and intensity. Volume usually involves counts, skills, elements, and so forth, number of attempts, that sort of thing. Intensity usually involves rates, a difficulty value, skills per unit time, and so forth. Response units are usually physiological, although they can also be considered, part of skill development, hitting skills, going higher, tumbling faster, and so forth. So the units of measurement for response are somewhat more scientific. Lactate, muscle oxygen saturation, strength, flexibility, rate of force development, and so forth. Dosage variables, I would show you some data now. These are from the US national team, women's team, prior to an Olympic Games, an Olympic trials for team selection. Okay, you would expect that the amount of training time should be roughly similar throughout, but our stupid coaches at this time showed a decrease in training time early, moderation, and then a dramatic increase in training time. They also tended to save their total routine performances until way too close to the Olympic trials. And the same can be seen, the one aspect that was particularly interesting was, I'll show you on the next slide, or actually, sorry, on the slide after this. The response variables, or I'm sorry, I missed something here. These are dosage variables, vault elements, you just count them. Okay, balance beam elements. There are a variety of ways to count them. Guidos and others have proposed equations and done some rather complex things. I never did that. I just used the simple count. Okay, then response variables were pre-practice resting heart rate, scale weight, sleep duration, illness symptoms, injury, psychological mood state, and so forth. This is an Olympian recording her skill elements on a notepad.
Many of the girls face their training. They have to face the computer.
I hope you can hear this.
The computer stores all kinds of things from day to day and week to week. And whenever Bill wants to find out something, he always looks back on that day. First of all, we come in and we weigh ourselves, and the scales are kilograms. And so then you just punch into the computer what it is in kilograms, and it'll multiply it for you. It'll ask questions like your heart rate, what food you ate in 24 hours, what time you got out, what time you went to sleep.
Bill combines the detailed knowledge of each athlete's physical condition.
Okay, so that was something I actually did. I had my athletes record their daily training day by computer. Then I found that that was somewhat slow and there was always a line by the computer and it was not efficient. So I switched to doing a dot sheet where dosage and response information were placed in a dot sheet like you would take a test in school. I wrote the computer software and developed analysis tools for this, or finding trends in the data. This is what the dot sheet looked like at the time. So it shows all the different characteristics that I was interested in. The top part is actually the response variables, and the bottom part are the dosage variables, elements, routines, and so forth. And then the total training time. Oops. Okay. Thing is arguing with me. So the data analysis and coaching reports, I used artificial intelligence and an expert system that I coded in the computer language Prolog.
She is registering very high.
So this was a television interview.
Already helps train future Olympic athletes. Each week, gymnasts on the U.S. team send him information about their weight, moods, sleep patterns, and training routines.
Average sleep disturbances is up, mood states is going down. So we have an athlete who's fatigued, it looks like. So in that case, you might say that in her training program, we might want to back off.
Okay, this is part of a report that the athlete and coach would get once a week. I recorded dosage variables in volume, intensity, training time, routines, whether the variable is increasing or decreasing, and then response variables are at the bottom, the averages, and then whether something was changing or not. We did use this for athletes, and it worked beautifully. I coded over 200 Prolog rules. This was printed out in English. One of the aspects of monitoring now is that most of the computer models or computer approaches you see are simple databases. They don't tell you what's happening. You have to hunt for it. So the Prolog rules and the artificial intelligence expert system finds the aspects of the training that need attention and then tells you. And so you would get a single page output telling you about all the variables. This is abbreviated, by the way. And then warnings of what may be an indication of a problem. And then you would investigate further. Okay, so real data is hard to come by when people ask about gymnastics. So I'm going to show you the data that I have. This shows an athlete and the data that comes off the computer printer at that time. You can see decreasing weight, decreasing followed by increasing resting heart rate. She is sick, she feels fatigued, and she is not cheerful. Okay, if I prettify it, and it was published in an article in the journal Sports, this shows the trend of her declining weight. This shows the trend of her decreasing followed by increasing heart rate. Decreasing weight and combined with increasing heart rate is a classic symptom of overtraining. The hassle is that at this period right here, this last data point, she had a career-ending injury, dislocated her elbow. So was that predictable? Yes. Did we predict it? No, not really, but the coach was warned but chose to continue anyway. Okay, here's an example of sleep disturbances. This is the preparatory period. This is the competitive period. Does this athlete have a diagnosable sleep disturbance or sleep illness? And the answer is no. Baseline, when there's virtually no pressure, she's fine. As you get closer and closer to nationals, her rate and magnitude of sleep disturbances increases. And so this single subject approach to analysis of a single athlete shows that she's not sick. She's just struggling with pressure. In a study that I did for 5 years worth of data and over 5,000 training records, this shows the new injuries for a gymnastics team spiking in the beginning when they're not in shape and they get lots of owies. Then during the skill development phase, combination development, routine development, there's a spike. And then routine performance prior to competition, you can see injuries tend to go up. And then if you not this part, this is right after Christmas, but if you count the number of peaks, there are 10, and there are 10 competitions in the year. Several sports psychologists have shown that injuries tend to go up immediately prior to a competition. And so the new injuries followed that pattern nicely. Then continuing injuries, in other words, injuries that are not healed yet, continue to be recorded over time. It showed dramatically that once you're injured for the entire season, is that they never really seem to heal. Okay, this was another look at data showing illness symptoms here: cold, headache, stomach ache, fever, etc. This is psychological mood state where helplessness is going through the roof. This is the person that had the sleep disturbances. And nervousness, again, immediately prior to a national championship, which occurs over here. Sleep records are recorded in time to bed, time awake, number of hours, and presence or absence of sleep disturbances. Daily weight was recorded by scale weight. Here's an example of an athlete who is dieting, and here's an example of an athlete who's growing. Here are the national team data I mentioned before. This one is a pretty revealing example of how dumb coaches can be. You would expect, if you're following Matveyev's classic approach to periodization, that intensity should increase throughout the preparatory period. However, should conditioning elements spike immediately prior to the Olympic trials, which occurred over here? And the answer, of course, is no. Should volume increase along with intensity prior to an Olympic trials? Of course not. That's just dumb. All you get is tired. Training time dramatically increased. If you look at total routine, same problem. Average psychological state shows that there's a decay, a dramatic decay, after competitions. This supports the idea of time off or dramatically reduced training load immediately after a contest. Okay? The last part of monitoring is statistical process control. It's a statistical technique, but it's not difficult, so your eyes shouldn't glaze over. Training is a process. Statistical process control, obviously they have the same name, and the title is a way of dealing with that in a very formal and statistical way. If you know what normal or desired path is for development, can you detect if an athlete deviates? And the normal path is considered a baseline, and it requires systematic monitoring. Okay, so what we're interested in is identifying discrepant, extreme, or outlier data where we have a cause for concern. If the athlete is progressing along fine, there's no need to intervene. You can use training diaries or periodic testing or both, which I did. And I moved from a paper diary to computers because I could never get through the paper diaries. You can determine how the training program is progressing, and it's based on simple descriptive statistics and probability, things that you can do with a bloody spreadsheet. Here's roughly how it works. Time is shown along the bottom. Here is any performance characteristic, let's say strength. You could assume that the test characteristics of strength will follow a normal curve. It's tipped on its side because we're looking at it over time. Here are the test results, and then you can see that there's been a decline in the test results at this point. Should you be concerned here? How about here? Should you be concerned now? If the test results decay to there, should you be concerned? And the answer is, of course you should. You can determine how concerned you want to be based on the statistical distribution of your test data. And it can be, again, any performance parameter, heart rate, dosage response, dosage variable, response variable, any variable. Okay, here's an example from an Olympian, one of my Olympians. You can see that her pre-practice resting heart rate is elevated during this phase, which I'm going to call the treatment phase. And then after Christmas break, her resting heart rate declines dramatically. Anything that's above this level, which is called the upper control limit, is above 0.8 of the standard deviation. These are cause for concern and should be investigated. Also, if something is well below, you might be concerned. But when you find here that the vast majority of the data are within the control limits, we are fine. The athlete's fine. No need for concern. In fact, you could put the hammer down and train harder. Okay, here's an example of sleep disturbances. Sleep disturbances here are well above the upper control limit. Here, well above the upper control limit. Here and here, again, well above the upper control limit. So these could be cause for local concern where I might want to investigate. This was not the athlete that I showed in the earlier slide. Okay, this one is a very important one because it shows a number of things at the same time. This is showing illness symptoms, just a simple sum. And this is showing pre-practice resting heart rate. This is the upper control limit for heart rate, lower control limit for heart rate. And this is 2 standard deviations. So the probability of getting values above this line is about 5%. So now if I look at this one, we see that there's an at upper control limit, above the upper control limit, above the upper control limit, above the upper control limit, and above the upper control limit. And when I look at all of them except this one, all of them correspond to high levels of illness symptoms. So you can use resting heart rate as an indicator that something's going haywire in terms of illness. And prior to the 2000 Olympic Games, I used the Bosco test to test national team members. The Bosco test is a 60-second vertical jump test where you record time in the air and time on the ground. I've used it for both women and men to assess fitness. What I found with the women's team was that all of the athletes that showed improving performance or no change went to the Olympic Games. This is the Olympic team, by the way, not a squad. The team that went to Sydney. All of them that stayed the same or went up were on the floor during competition. The ones that showed deteriorating performance self-destructed when they got to Sydney, and one was sent home, the other was made the alternate. Finally, you can also use other means of assessing, monitoring things. For example, in this case, I'm using a thermal camera to diagnose sacroiliac pain. In this case, nerve entrapment in of the perineals. Okay, that brings my contribution to an end. And so I guess I will turn it back to Paul and share.
Well, thank you, Bill. That was an excellent presentation, very interesting, full of facts, and I'm sure we have many questions. One of the questions that comes to mind for me is, with the current situation, you alluded to it briefly at the beginning of your presentation, that's to do with this lockdown. You talk about continuity and consistency of training. We know that that's a principle, it's a golden rule that we shouldn't break. But this situation has been imposed on a lot of people, and I know there's been a different sort of presentation on this, but I'd just like to have your brief views on this lockdown and our gymnasts, that some who might have been away for 3 months from training, how do they go back after that big long break? What advice would you give in terms of planning and monitoring for coaches?
When they return to training and start up, this is going to be a very dangerous time, because their skills are probably still there, but their fitness isn't. And their specific fitness is definitely not there. And so I kept data on it actually when I was an athlete, that when we returned from breaks, Christmas break and Thanksgiving break and things like that, we always had a spike in injuries, and sometimes serious injuries. And so in my opinion, I think the athlete should be considered to be starting over, to start from zero and build it back up. Could you prepare an athlete for world level competition in the 3 months that you may have available before, I think there's a world championships this year, or there's something going on this year? I would say you probably can't, not safely. From my experience, if you start with the competition and work backwards, with women gymnasts, it takes about 6 weeks of routine preparation before going to a competition, and I'm surprised if they fall. And so then after that, it was another 6 weeks back in combination preparation, and then another, well, then back to the beginning of the training program. So you're already looking at 3 months just for combinations and routines. And so for men, I know it's a little different because their difficulty is astronomical. And so for them, the counting routines may not be the appropriate approach, but their fitness is tanked by now. The level of detraining they've probably acquired or endured has got to be enough to say that, you know, you really need to start over. And it will be very difficult to hold them back.
Sure.
Because they're going to be in a hurry to get back in shape and all that stuff. And I think I would take, if it were me, I would take 1 to 2 months and do little more than conditioning.
Yeah, I think that's
specific conditioning.
I think that's good sound advice, and to start off with basics and to build up gradually using that consistent approach that you mentioned. I just go to some of the questions from our participants, and I'd like to just say hi to Hardy Fink. Heidi, hi, it's good to hear from you. I hope you're well. And Hardy has a few questions for you, Bill. He asks something that's, that I kind of agree with. It's that many coaches will say they don't have time for all this planning. What would you say to them? They have a lot to do. What advice can you give to them?
You know, it's funny. I've heard this argument before from coaches from a variety of sports. And I have to say, you know, it's funny, not funny, haha, funny, weird. I did all this stuff when I was coaching. How did I manage to find the time?
Yeah.
So I think that's an excuse that's just indication of laziness.
Yeah, I think I kind of agree, Bill. And I think from a gymnast perspective, there's an interesting scenario as well. We have gymnasts that really don't like to plan themselves. They don't like to monitor. They don't like to follow a plan. They tend to be the talented mavericks, and they tend to sometimes do well, sometimes get injured, as you know, because of their inconsistent training. Are there any tips or advice you could give to their coaches or to those gymnasts to try to help them to knuckle down and follow a plan?
Yeah, I saw this in spades. Most recently, I worked as a sports scientist with USA Skiing and Snowboard, and their athletes are absolute mavericks. They don't have to show up for anything. They have no contractual agreements at all. And so they do whatever they want, whenever they want. And I told them that, you know, this approach is not going to win. And they're seeing it now fully because they have one world-class athlete. That's it. And I said, why on earth would you have all of these highly educated and trained professionals here working to help athletes achieve and then turn the reins over to someone who doesn't know what they're doing? And so I wish I had a socially acceptable answer to this, but the way I imposed it when all the data that you saw that were collected, it was required by the coach. There was no getting out of it. If you didn't do it, then I hope the door didn't hit you in the butt.
That's good. There's a question from Newton Santos Viana Jr. And he talks about the bit you were speaking about, percentage allocation of how you break up the mesocycles and the microcycles. And he said that this schedule is a team need for beginners and lower level, but in the high level, do you use this percentage individually? How do you do that when you've got individuals that might need more floor time, more bars time, as opposed to a group? How do you do that?
I do the same thing. Yeah. I don't know how many individuals you're talking about, but
So it's,
you know, I mean, I've done it with teams of 15.
Yeah.
So
presumably you need a gym with a practical ability to be able to sort of split up the apparatus. That's sometimes quite hard to work into a club schedule, presumably.
Oh, I see. Yes, because you rotate from event to event. Yes. Yeah. Well, I just made sure that the rotation schedule was fluid. You know, when you accomplished what you were supposed to, you were permitted to move on. Or you could work on something that was less vital at that time, something of that nature. That is sometimes, I admit, in a club setting, very difficult to do because you can't do a fluid rotation thing because there are just too many people. And so then I have to wonder, do you just need more apparatus and more coaches, you know, in order to administer that? And if so, then that to me is an administrative problem, not a periodization problem.
Okay. Hardy talks about support teams. You've spoken a lot about medical support and all the analysis that goes along with that. And Hardy mentions that many clubs, many coaches don't have access to a support team of medical, scientific, or training specialists. How important is it, in your opinion, to have such support teams?
I would say that facility comes first. You can't train if you don't have facility. Then the next thing that comes is time. If you don't have enough time to train, then you're not going to achieve very high levels. Okay, then the next thing to happen next thing that you need are talented and motivated coaches who are well educated and very committed. And then the next thing is ancillary staff, which are doctors and whatnot. So you must be awfully rural if you don't have access to medical people and whatnot.
Yeah, I think if a coach is working largely on their own and they don't have such good regular access to all of that support, an anonymous question, what sort of things should they focus on? What are their absolute priorities and what things could they possibly discard?
Well, they need to be educated in sports medicine because, let's face it, the coach administers a lot of the stuff.
Right.
And so when I started my gym school back when the earth was still cooling, what I did was I looked around the Chicago area for athletic-oriented physicians. And I found a number of them. And all I had to do was tell them that, look, if you will promise me two things. One is that you will drop by the gym once a week and give the kids the hairy eyeball exam, you know what I mean? What's going on? Anybody got any owies? That kind of stuff. And that if I send you an injured or sick athlete, you will work them into your schedule within 24 hours. In return for doing that, I will name you my team physician. And then you get to, I took them to Olympic trials. I made sure that they got lots of warm fuzzies for helping me out. And the kids loved them. They enjoyed coming and working with kids. It was one of the smartest things I ever did.
Nice. There's been a few questions, Bill, about the practical application of monitoring. A question about whether or not you feel that all high-performance athletes should have a logbook to help with the monitoring of overtraining. And Marco Bartoletto asks about, in the case of resource limitations, financial, technological, etc., would it be possible for you to indicate the simple ones that can significantly contribute to monitoring?
I've tried a lot of them. I've done paper diaries.
Yeah.
Where I just had them draw a dot on the thing where their heart rate was and stuff like that. The problem is processing it, is that I can't extract the information out of it quickly enough to make a difference. And so that's what took me to using a computer and doing the daily data entry. With a little education, they can be taught to, find their heart rate and so forth and put that down. It took a little while. but it wasn't that bad. And I tried to set it up so that they could enter their data or fill out the dot sheet in less than 60 seconds. That was very important. And paper diaries, I find, just don't work. Computers, good Lord. I mean, you can get a used computer for next to nothing today. And access to the internet and stuff, things that were luxuries now, that would have been luxuries when I did it, are ubiquitous now. So again, I don't think I would say that it's impossible. I did it. And I did it with stone knives and bear skins.
Maybe there's a demand for, everybody has mobile phones and apps. Maybe we can develop apps more to look at recording training, and those results can go directly towards a coach, and the gymnast just taps the results in. What do you think of that? Is that possible?
Yeah, I've often wanted to have something that would record the forces on an apparatus.
I agree with that.
And you could walk by, and in my day, it would have been like a credit card, and you'd slide your credit card through, and then the instrumentation would download what just happened. But now you could use your cell phone, which wasn't available when I was doing this. So that's not that hard to do. And if you're involved in a national program, then it seems to me that instrumenting the apparatus to do just such a thing would be so exciting for someone, an academic, that they would just be ecstatic to help do that kind of work.
It's an interesting idea. Just a quick question from Rabah Ahmed from Kuwait, who asks about biorhythms. Have you done any research into gymnast biorhythms and how that affects their training?
No, biorhythms of the old 30-day cycle, 28-day cycle, and all that kind of stuff. We know that's been debunked, and it's not physiologically valid. If you want to refer to biorhythms in terms of other variables that are usable, then that's what I was doing, was monitoring biorhythms, because response variables are essentially rhythmic. And so if you watch them long enough, you will find rhythms, no question. But oftentimes the time between data acquisition and reporting is long enough that the rhythm can be destroyed. So it takes some pretty sophisticated math in order to do that well. And again, I don't rely on a particular marker. I found that the response variables are characteristic but idiosyncratic. Some people will, if some people are tired, they will respond by sleep disturbances. And other people will respond by elevated heart rate. Not everyone responds the same way. That's why you kind of have to have a shotgun approach of assessing numerous variables, searching for any variable that shifts outside normal patterns, and then identify that, and then just investigate. Sometimes you find something, sometimes you don't. And if you don't find anything, well, look, it was an anomaly, and you move on. If you do find something, well, then yada yada. So and I set the data analysis so that it was fairly generous in identifying outliers, because there's really no harm in investigating whether or not something's ongoing or something is happening to an athlete that may need some concern. If it doesn't need concern, you move on.
Thank you, Bill. I think we have time for just one more question, and that if I may be allowed to, will come from me. And it's around the sort of continuity and consistency question that you mentioned. We have gymnasts or we have coaches that quite often prepare for competition. They start learning new elements. They go into their competition preparation phase, and they stop doing their new elements. How important is it to maintain some sort of timing for any new elements that sit outside of your competition program, recording routines and things like that? Is it okay to drop those elements, or should you keep them ticking over? What's your opinion on that kind of thing?
Well, I found that skill learning is fairly stubborn in that it doesn't tend to go away like fitness does. The problem often happens is that the specific fitness for the new skill may decline. And so if there's but fortunately it doesn't take much to maintain the fitness. So when you have a little spare time, for example, you finished your work for the day or your event tasks for that day, then by all means, go ahead and do some things that you're trying to maintain but not intending to use. Again, it's a training time resource problem. So if that's really important, then you build it in, you give it a percentage, you allocate time, and you make sure it happens.
Well, thank you, Bill. I think the biggest thing that I've drawn from this is the important principle, the principle of continuity and consistency, and just gradually building up in a phased approach, avoiding the rest periods and the amount of time that gymnasts stop training before they load up for these high events. I could ask many more questions, Bill, but I think we're running out of time. So at this point, I'd like to thank you once again for your excellent and informative presentation. This will be available on the FIG YouTube channel, I believe, where more questions can be asked if anybody wants to continue asking you questions. And at this point, if I can ask Yanni to come back in and just sum things up on behalf of the Education Commission. Are you there, Yanni?
Yes, Paul. Hi, I'm here, and then from my side, I want to thank you also for this presentation. I know I was glued to my screen for an hour and a half and taking notes, so it was really informative. And I would like to thank also all the participants for their attention, and then especially our expert Bill Sands, and then of course you, Paul, for taking a good job of moderating this. So thank you both, and then just a few reminders of the upcoming seminars we have on the next few weeks. So here we have, like I said in the beginning, this was the fourth one, and as Paul mentioned, all of these can be found in FIG Education channel on YouTube, where you can still post your comments and leave further questions. But the next week's topic will be Preparing for Success by Planning Ahead by Ignacio Grande from Spain. And the last one, as for now, is the Training for Growing Child, Understanding the Growth and Maturation by Keith Russell from Canada. So thank you again on behalf of the Education Commission of FIG, and hope to get you back next week.